Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to a banner review. The banners for Furina have been revealed. She is going to be paired with Baizhu as the other 5-star, and the 4 stars on the banner are going to be Charlotte, Collei, and Beidou. 5-star weapons, we have Furina's signature weapon, as well as the Jadefall Splendor, Baizhu's signature. 4-star weapons, Stringless, Sack Sword, Dragon's Bane, Sacrificial Fragments, and the Bell. We're gonna start with Furina, obviously. Now, if you're interested in knowing about like what I think about her, all that good stuff, description of her kit, what she does, make sure you go watch the pre-release. It's a pretty long video, but it's one of my most in-depth pre-releases so far, so I would encourage you to go watch that. If you just want the big lines, you can think of her as, what if Yelan applied less Hydro and did less damage, but provided a huge buff to the whole team instead of only a decent buff to the active character. She also forces you to bring a healer, and because her buff applies to the whole team, if you actually max it out, then her damage is competitive with Yelan. But yeah, again, right, if you wanna know more about her specifically, make sure you go watch the pre-release video. I do want to touch a little bit on constellations in here because that's the thing that's most relevant to banner discussions. So at C0, obviously she's a good unit. C1, effectively, the limit increase is nice, but it's also just that you get 150 fanfare for free, which is what her buff scales from. So basically her ult at level 10 will give you up to 300 stacks. Each stack's 0.25% damage, so up to 75% damage bonus based on your healing and your health lost. This makes it so that you instantly start with 25 instead of starting at 0 and it's scaling with your health. Wait, no, sorry, not 25, at 37.5. And instead of being capped at 75, it's now capped at 100. So it's a pretty good con. It opens up some possibilities of playing her without an actual dedicated healer, although that's still not something I would personally recommend. I think that's still a little scuffed. And in teams where you are playing her with a dedicated healer, then this is effectively just about 25%, a little bit more than that, additional damage percent. Pretty good. C2 is, it basically makes it so that even if you don't have a healer, you'll still max out her damage buff. But if you do have a healer, her personal damage is going to be a lot higher because she's going to gain HP based on her fanfare stacks. It's a pretty strong constellation, right? I think it's pretty similar to C2's from some of the other Archons. Obviously, it does a thing different. Like, it's less of a damage increase to your team than Raiden's C2 in Raiden teams, because Furina will not be doing 70% of your damage like Raiden does in Raiden Hyper teams. But it's still a fairly good damage increase. Burst level, skill level, pretty alright. C4 generates energy, basically 16 energy over a rotation, pretty alright. C6, you have two options. Either it makes it so that you can heal, right? When you use your skill, you get a Hydro Infusion. You can either get healing from it or increase the damage that you do with your Hydro Infusion. It's a pretty good con. All in all, she's got some fairly strong constellations, I would say. But yeah, if you're looking at her personal damage and at, like, how good she can be, not just personal damage, but like at how good she's gonna be at C0 and what you can gain from like constellations versus signature weapons. When you're in teams that have a lot of particle generation, especially hydro particle generation, so when you're playing her in like double or triple hydro teams, her signature weapon can be pretty good. But outside of that, because her ER requirements are going to be fairly high and her signature weapon doesn't actually help with that, there's going to be a lot of options that are not too far behind her signature. Again, if you want more detail on that, make sure you go check out the pre-release. But I would say that in general, I'd recommend her early constellations more than her signature weapon if you really want to go for something to improve her. I think they'll make a bit more of a difference. But at the end of the day, it is up to you. Baizhu is going to become quite a bit better because of Furina, right? Furina consumes your team's HP and forces you to have a healer that heals the whole team. His biggest weakness tends to be ER requirements, just being incredibly high, which is something that gets basically not fixed, but alleviated a lot by his C1 if you want to get it. That being said, he does heal quite a bit even without your burst. You'll be able to get your stacks pretty easily for your fanfare on Furina. He just has fairly good synergy with her. Furina is going to be used in quite a few teams where you actually have one dedicated on-field character that doesn't want to give a lot of field time to the rest of the team. team, which makes him have some value over Yao Yao in those teams. I think pre-Furina, there's just not that many teams where Baizhu is a significant improvement over Yao Yao. Post-Furina, it's still not that many, but it is a lot more teams. So there's a bit more value to him now. He's still far from necessary, though. Now, the 4 stars. I haven't done a pre-release for Charlotte. I had recorded a pre-release, and then they nerfed her to the ground. And now I kind of just... Ugh. She's still not terrible, right? Basically what she does, her E, she does... whatever. She takes a picture. You can hold your E, your camera will focus, and take a better picture, I guess. It deals cryo damage over time when you take a picture, but it doesn't last very long. The hold E lasts a bit longer, but it takes a very long time to actually charge up. Like, it's almost a 5-star burst animation, except you're not in iframes. It's hard to justify actually holding it. And if you don't actually hold it, like all the way through, you generate 3 particles, whereas if you do hold it, you generate 5. Now, it used to be, before the nerf, that if you did a hold but you didn't wait for it to focus, you would still get 5. In removing that, basically, there's just a lot of teams where you can't really afford the time to focus because it's just not worth it. And in those teams, it's a 2-particle nerf every time you use your skill, which is pretty huge. Her burst is basically just pretty big AoE heal to your whole team. It also leaves a healing field, but it heals for a hilariously small amount, so it basically doesn't do anything from that. Her C1 helps increase her healing. So all in all, Charlotte is a fine unit. She used to be a lot better before the nerf because you could have used her for like as a good battery. Now she's a downgrade to other alternatives in terms of particle generation. So it's a bit harder to justify her over some of those other options. Especially because, I can't believe I'm saying this, but we already have a cryo healer that heals a lot, Mika, and yeah. But she's alright. You can use her as an on-fielder because she's a catalyst user. I think her constellations past Constellation 1 don't really matter. It's really the Constellation 1 that's like the big one. And she does heal the most out of any healer when it comes to how much you heal if you just swap into them, use burst, and immediately swap out, right? At Constellation 1 Plus, she heals a lot from her burst, which is nice. Next, we have Collei. Now, Collei is not a great unit. She's got very committal animations, special ICD on her burst that makes it not apply that much dendro. But she does have some fairly nice niche use case in specific teams. Because she's not burst reliant, she can be pretty nice to use in overworld for your dendro application. But she also can be pretty nice to use in any team where you don't have a set, strict rotation and you want to be able to adapt to the situation, right? Because she has a lot of application just from her skill, especially if you play her with Sakbo. I know she sees a lot of play in Nilo teams when it comes to speedrunning. Her constellations increase her overall utility. Mainly, her C2 increases her dendro application. Her C4 increases or gives her an EM buff, right? Whenever you use your burst, you buff your team's EM by 60, which is nice. C6 increases dendro application a little bit as well. Overall, I'd say that at C0, she's kind of just very, very niche. At C2, I think she's a decent competitor for like a second dendro unit in Nilo teams. At C4 plus, I think she's an alright choice for your dendro unit in Quicken. However, I do think that in most situations, you'd kind of rather run Yao Yao or Baizhu and run an offensive-focused Electro unit rather than running Collei and a unit like Kuki. So if you want a healer, I think it's a lot harder to fit Collei in those teams. But she does work in them if you don't want a healer or if you just really want to use Kuki. All in all, Collei's not bad. I think she feels bad to play because her elemental skill animation is pretty long and you can't dash cancel it. So a lot of the time it feels just so bad to use. And the AoE of her skill is very thin. So if the enemies are knocked down, your skill can pass over them. It also doesn't go straight, so sometimes it'll go around the enemy and not hit them. There's a lot of things that can go wrong when playing Collei that make her feel, in my opinion, pretty unfun to play. But when things go right with her, she's actually a fairly good unit. Like, she's not terrible. Personally, I'm pretty happy that she's on the banner because I'm going to go for this banner. I want to get Furina. I'm at C3. So getting that C4 would be nice. Next, we have Beidou. Beidou's a very interesting character. I think a lot of people, or Beidou's a lot less talked about these days, but I do think she's incredibly underrated right now. A lot of people who don't play Beidou don't realize how much value she actually brings in terms of defensive utility. This damage reduction paired with the increase to resistance to interruption actually makes her a very solid defensive utility option that is also good offensively. Now, she's not going to be the best defensive utility option, but especially when it comes to stuff like Hytham teams, stuff like Aggravate teams with a driver like Sucrose, you just get so much value out of that defensive utility. Outside of the defensive utility, though, she can function in any Hyperloom team without yoinking Hyperloom. So you'd use her with Raiden or Kuki, and you have them built on full EM and her built on a normal build. She does reasonable damage, although when you're in single target, it's not very good. But in AoE, it's very good. A lot of people think that when you're at more than 2 targets, Beidou stops being quite as good because it only bounces up to 2 times on the main target rather than 3 times. But I think that's kind of a misconception, because in most situations, like when it comes to your off-field units, their AoE is not always hitting every single enemy that's present, right? Beidou's guaranteed to always have 5 hits. Usually when you're against 3 enemies, there's a decent portion of your AoE damage that's only going to hit 2 of them. And with Beidou, you still get the 5, so it's not actually that big of a nerf. And it's also just enough damage that it's still good, even if you're comparing it to stuff that's hitting 3 targets. Overall, it's just pretty alright. The Electro Res Dread at C6 is quite good. Obviously, Beidou's C2 is her most relevant constellation. It significantly increases her damage by making the amount of bounces go from 3 to 5. Or I guess it bounces 4 times, but the amount of damage instances go from 3 to 5. Then C5 is also quite nice, and C6 is quite nice. But yeah, she's far from like a unit that's very necessary, but I do think a lot of people underestimate how valuable she can be. So at the very least, she might be worth considering, and constellations on her are not useless like they can be on characters that are just pretty dog shit. But yeah, so that does it for the characters. Let's get into the weapons. I've already talked a little bit about Furina's signature weapon, but let's talk about it a little bit more. It's a low base attack, crit damage weapon. When the equipping character's current HP increases or decreases, elemental skill damage dealt will be increased by 8% for 6 seconds. Max 3 stacks. This effect can be triggered once every 0.2 seconds. When other party members' current HP increases or decreases, the equipping character's max HP will be increased by 14% for 6 seconds. Max 2 stacks. This effect can be triggered once every 0.2 seconds. The aforementioned effects can be triggered even if the wielder is off-field. So, in other words, you gain 24% skill damage and 28% HP. That's the passive. Except it only works on Furina. Overall, it's kind of a whatever weapon. Like, it is good on Furina, but like I mentioned earlier, in quite a few teams, her ER requirements are high enough that this is not that big of an upgrade over some of the alternatives that you might already have, like Festering Desire, like the new fishing pipe weapon, like Fav if your ER requirements are very high. Compared to other 5-star weapons, it isn't that big, as big of an increase. But when you're playing on low ER requirements, she doesn't have the greatest options, right? A lot of the weapons that give her a lot of stats that she wants also give her ER, so they become a lot less valuable at low ER. So if you are playing specifically at low ER requirements and double or triple Hydra teams, then the signature increases in value a little bit, but even then, it's still not that insane of a weapon. But yeah, the Jadefall Splendor, boy, that's definitely a weapon of all time. I mean, it's alright on Baizhu, but like, the reality is it's not even that good on him, because yeah, you get a decent amount of energy, but you get less energy than if you were to use Fav. It's not that much better than Proto Amber either, and in a lot of teams with Baizhu with Furina, you'd actually kind of rather have Prototype Amber's effect than this, because the healing on the rest of the team helps give you a bit more stacks on Furina, because Baiju's skill will not be enough by itself to full heal your team if you only use it once. And without C1, you only use it once at least at the beginning of your rotation. All in all, this is one of the worst weapons you can get. It's just not good. When it comes to the 4-star weapons, it's kind of interesting. Stringless is good on characters like Fischl. I mean, it's also a pretty good option on Venti, I guess, on Child. It's an okay weapon with decent refinements. It's on the better side of the 4-star bow options. Sack Sword is interesting. I think a lot of people think that Sack Sword is incredibly good on Xingqiu, and it can be good on Xingqiu, but I think it's mostly good on Xingqiu in teams where you actually vape his skill, like in Sucrose National. And in other teams, it's not nearly as good, and it tends to actually be worse than Fav. On top of needing to be R3+ to even have the cooldown allow you to use it every rotation. And then on top of that, sometimes it just doesn't proc and you're just very angry. With Fav, if your Fav doesn't proc, you just attack one more time and it'll proc. Obviously though, there's a lot of people only have so many Favs, so it's still a fine option, right? If you don't have a Fav available. But I think in most situations, it is not Xingqiu's best option. However, that doesn't mean it's a useless weapon. There is another character that actually does quite like Sack Sword, and that character is Kazuha. In teams, as a general rule, Fav tends to be better on Kazuha, but in teams that can allow a bit more field time to Kazuha, because Kazuha's E animation is pretty long, right? You have to jump, and then you have to do the plunge attack. So if you have to do one more E, then you'll obviously spend more time on field, and if you have other things that you could be doing, then spending that more time on field isn't really increasing your DPS, right? But it is giving you better grouping, and in a lot of teams, you can afford field time on him. Stuff like Aggravate EI, for example. But it's really mostly the additional grouping that makes it not quite nice on him. I think it's incredibly rare that Iron Sting is a good option on him compared to Sack and Fav. I think in most situations where Fav isn't that good, Sack is still better than Iron Sting. So all in all, it's a pretty good weapon to have. Obviously, again, if you only have one Fav and is busy on someone else, then having a Sack Sword for Kazuha can be very nice. It's alright. It's probably about average when it comes to swords, maybe a little bit above average, but not that insane. But yeah, next, Dragon's Bane. Dragon's Bane it's a weapon. These days, it's mostly a Raiden weapon for Raiden Hyperbloom, but it's also a weapon for Hu Tao. Now, Hu Tao's 4-star options are basically Dragon's Bane and the Battle Pass options, right? He doesn't have the best actual free-to-play 4-star options, which makes Dragon's Bane pretty decent on her. But if you're not free-to-play, if you buy the Battle Pass and you have a deathmatch or the new Ballad of the Fjords, then Dragon's Bane is just worse. But yeah, if that's not the case, then this can be a good weapon for you. But when it comes to Raiden, the refinements don't really do anything on it, so if you already have one, then getting an additional one won't do anything. And then next up, Sacrificial Fragment is a very nice weapon for Sucrose in teams where you don't really want to use her on TDDS, which is mainly Xiangling teams. And that's kind of it. It is a pretty good damage focus option for Nahida, but it's not that much better than her other options. Like, it's not even that much better than something like Magic Guide. Refinements on it also don't really do anything for Nahida. And personally, when I play Nahida, she's almost always on Fav, so it's also a good option for Kokomi and Bloom teams and Nilo teams, Barbara as well. But yeah, all in all, it's again about average, maybe slightly above average. And then finally, the Bell is dog shit. But there's only one dog shit 4-star weapon, so when it comes to the 4-star options, they're not that bad. They're like about average, I'd say. You don't have any standout, incredibly good 4-star option, but most of them are good. Like, more of them are not useless than average. So if you are planning on going for Furina's signature, then you might get a few useful weapons along the way. But none of these are weapon banner exclusive, and a few of these don't really benefit from further refinements after a certain point. And like I mentioned earlier, her early constellations in most situations are better than her signature. So overall, I think this is one of the lowest value weapon banners without being a bad one, right? It's interesting because it's not a bad weapon banner, but it's just so low value. But yeah, so honestly, unless you're specifically going for like high constellation Furina plus her signature weapon, I don't really think there's ever a reason to pull on this weapon banner. So that's gonna be it for the banner review. Make sure you tune in when the patch drops. I will be live on Twitch, testing Furina, testing Charlotte, testing a lot of shit. It'll be fun. I hope to see you there, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye, YouTube.